It all began in the spring of 1978. At first, no one believed they were witnessing the start of one of the longest criminal investigations in American history. On May 25, a suspicious package was discovered at the University of Illinois in Chicago. The package had been addressed to a professor, but it was returned because the recipient was no longer at the university. When a campus security officer noticed the abandoned package, he picked it up and decided to inspect it. Moments later, the package exploded. The officer suffered injuries to his hand and body. Fortunately, he survived. Investigators rushed to the scene, treating the explosion as an isolated incident. At the time, there was no reason to believe this attack was connected to anything larger. The homemade explosive device was unlike most bombs investigators had seen before. It had been carefully assembled using ordinary materials. There were very few clues. No witnesses who had seen the person responsible. No fingerprints that could identify a suspect. The case quickly went cold. Less than a year later, another explosion shattered that assumption. This time, another package bomb injured a graduate student at Northwestern University. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Both devices had been handmade. Both targeted people connected to universities. Both were built with extraordinary care. Investigators realized they might not be dealing with two separate crimes. Instead, they could be facing a single offender who was willing to strike again. As more attacks followed, federal authorities stepped in. The Federal Bureau of Investigation opened a major investigation, bringing together experts from different offices across the country. To organize the growing case, investigators created a simple internal abbreviation. The attacks were linked to universities, and later to airlines, so the investigation became known as UNABOM, short for University and Airline Bombing. Over time, the media transformed that abbreviation into a name the entire world would remember. The Unabomber. But despite the new name, investigators still had no idea who they were searching for. There were no photographs, no suspects, no clear motive, only a series of carefully constructed bombs, and a criminal who seemed determined to remain invisible. Each new attack increased public fear. Each unexploded package became a potential threat. And with every passing year, the mystery only grew deeper. As the years passed, the attacks did not stop. Instead, they became more frequent. Each new explosion brought fresh questions, but very few answers. The person responsible appeared to be learning from every attack, making each device more sophisticated than the last. Investigators soon realized they were not dealing with an amateur. Whoever was building these bombs possessed remarkable patience, technical skill, and an ability to remain completely hidden. The explosive devices were carefully handcrafted. Many of the components were made from common household materials, making them difficult to trace. Some parts were even carved from wood instead of metal, reducing the chances of being detected or linked to commercial manufacturers. Every bomb seemed to carry its own unique design, yet investigators noticed unmistakable patterns. The construction methods were similar. The craftsmanship was consistent. It was becoming increasingly clear that all the attacks were the work of a single individual. The fear spread far beyond the immediate victims. Universities across the country increased security. Employees were warned to be cautious of unexpected packages. Mailrooms adopted stricter inspection procedures. What had once been considered an ordinary delivery now carried a sense of uncertainty. No one knew where the next package would appear, or who the next target might be. As the investigation expanded, the FBI formed a specialized task force dedicated entirely to the case. Agents from multiple field offices worked together, sharing information and comparing evidence from every explosion. Thousands of interviews were conducted. Every tip from the public was carefully examined. Sketches were created. Potential suspects were investigated. But one by one, every promising lead came to a dead end. The bomber had left almost nothing behind. No usable fingerprints. No eyewitness willing to identify a suspect. No clear surveillance footage. It was as if the attacker appeared only long enough to deliver a package before disappearing without a trace. Years turned into nearly a decade. The attacks continued. Each successful bombing increased pressure on investigators. The media began covering the case nationwide. Newspapers published headlines describing a mysterious bomber who seemed impossible to catch. Television broadcasts warned viewers to remain alert for suspicious packages. Public anxiety continued to grow. Behind closed doors, investigators faced an uncomfortable reality. Despite years of effort, they still didn't know the bomber's identity. They didn't know where the bomber lived, and they had no reliable way to predict when or where the next attack would happen. Every unanswered question made the investigation more difficult. Yet the FBI refused to give up. They believed that somewhere within the evidence, no matter how small, there had to be a clue that would eventually expose the person behind the bombings. What they didn't realize was that the breakthrough would not come from a crime scene. It would come years later, from something the bomber chose to write. By the late 1980s, the investigation had reached a frustrating standstill. Years had passed since the first bombing. Dozens of investigators had worked tirelessly on the case. Yet the identity of the bomber remained a complete mystery. With traditional investigative methods producing few results, the FBI turned to another approach. Behavioral analysis. Experts from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit began studying every available detail of the case. Not just the bombs, but the targets, the timing, the locations, even the smallest details that most people would overlook. They believed that every criminal leaves behind more than physical evidence. They also leave behind patterns. The victims appeared to have little in common at first, but many were connected to universities, scientific research, technology, or the airline industry. Investigators wondered if these choices were random, or if they reflected a deeper motive. The bombs themselves revealed even more. Each device had been built with exceptional precision. The craftsmanship suggested someone who was patient, intelligent, and highly methodical. This was not someone acting on impulse. Every attack appeared to be carefully planned, sometimes months in advance. The bomber also demonstrated an unusual ability to adapt. As investigators improved their techniques, the devices changed. When one method became easier to detect, the bomber found another. It was almost as if the attacker was studying the investigation itself. The FBI's behavioral experts developed a profile. They believed the suspect was likely living alone, someone who preferred isolation over social interaction, someone with advanced technical skills, someone capable of spending long periods planning without attracting attention. But a profile is not proof. It cannot identify a suspect. It can only guide investigators toward the kind of person they might be looking for. Meanwhile, the attacks continued. Each new bombing renewed public fear and increased pressure on law enforcement. The case had now become one of the FBI's highest priorities. Hundreds of agents were assigned to the investigation over the years. Thousands of tips arrived from across the country. People reported suspicious neighbors, former classmates, co-workers, even family members. Every lead had to be checked. Most went nowhere. The investigation grew larger and more complex with every passing year. Then, in 1995, something happened that no one expected. Instead of sending another bomb, the unknown attacker sent a message. A message that would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. More than 30,000 words long. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a threat. It was a manifesto. And hidden within those thousands of words was the clue that investigators had been searching for all along. By 1995, the investigation had reached a critical point. 17 years had passed since the first bombing. Despite countless interviews, forensic examinations, and thousands of leads, investigators were still searching for a suspect they could not identify. Then, something unexpected happened. The bomber contacted the media. Instead of sending another explosive device, he sent a letter. Inside was an extraordinary proposal. He claimed that if a lengthy document he had written was published in major newspapers, the bombings would stop. The document was unlike anything investigators had seen before. It stretched across more than 30,000 words. It explained the author's views on technology, modern society, and the direction of civilization. The document quickly became known as the Manifesto. Federal investigators now faced an incredibly difficult decision. Publishing the document could give the bomber exactly what he wanted. It might encourage copycat criminals seeking publicity, but refusing to publish it could mean more attacks. Officials carefully debated every possible outcome. After weeks of discussion, authorities made a controversial decision. The manifesto would be released to the public. Their reasoning was simple. If millions of people read the document, someone might recognize the author's writing style, opinions, or unique way of expressing ideas. It was a calculated risk. The manifesto appeared in newspapers across the United States. Within days, millions of readers had seen it. Some dismissed it immediately. Others carefully analyzed every paragraph. Meanwhile, investigators received thousands of phone calls, letters, and tips. Most were quickly ruled out. But among those responses was one that immediately caught the FBI's attention. A man contacted investigators with an unsettling observation. As he read the manifesto, he noticed something strangely familiar. Certain phrases, specific expressions, even the way the arguments were organized. They reminded him of letters written years earlier by someone he knew very well. His own brother. At first, he struggled with the idea. Could someone from his own family really be connected to one of the most notorious investigations in the country? It was almost impossible to believe. Yet the similarities were too significant to ignore. He made the difficult decision to contact the FBI. Investigators treated the information seriously. They obtained earlier writings and began comparing them with the manifesto. Instead of looking only at the ideas, experts focused on language itself. Word choice, sentence structure, recurring phrases, unusual expressions. Every detail was examined. The similarities were remarkable. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, investigators believed they had something they had never had before. A credible suspect. The investigation was about to enter its most important chapter. The mystery that had challenged the FBI for nearly 18 years was finally beginning to unravel. The information provided by the suspect's brother marked a turning point in the investigation. For the first time in nearly 18 years, investigators had a lead that was supported by more than suspicion. But they couldn't rely on similarities in writing alone. They needed evidence that would stand up in court. The FBI quietly began gathering information. Agents reviewed public records. They examined the suspect's background, education, and past activities. Everything was compared against the timeline of the bombings. As the investigation continued, more pieces of the puzzle appeared to fit together. The suspect had lived in places connected to earlier events in the case. He possessed the technical knowledge needed to construct sophisticated explosive devices. And perhaps most importantly, his personal writings shared remarkable similarities with the manifesto. Still, investigators moved carefully. A mistake at this stage could jeopardize years of work. Every step required legal approval. Every piece of evidence had to be thoroughly documented. Weeks of surveillance followed. Agents observed the suspect from a distance, hoping to learn more about his daily routine. They wanted to understand how he lived and whether additional evidence might exist. The investigation eventually led agents to a small, isolated cabin near Lincoln, Montana. The cabin was simple. It had no electricity, no running water. It was surrounded by trees, far from busy roads and large towns. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary wooden structure, but investigators believed it might contain answers to one of America's greatest criminal mysteries. After obtaining a federal search warrant, agents prepared to enter the cabin. Every detail of the operation was carefully planned. Evidence specialists stood ready to document anything they found. Forensic experts prepared to examine every object inside. When agents entered the cabin, they immediately realized they had discovered something significant. The small room contained handwritten notebooks, tools, chemical materials, and components that investigators believed were consistent with the construction of homemade explosive devices. There were also drafts of writings, personal journals, and documents that investigators carefully collected for examination. Every item was photographed. Every piece of evidence was catalogued. Nothing was left to chance. The suspect was taken into custody without violence. After nearly 18 years of investigation, the manhunt was finally over. But making an arrest was only the beginning. Federal prosecutors now faced the enormous task of proving the case in court. The evidence collected from the cabin would be examined in extraordinary detail. Experts would compare documents, analyze materials, and connect years of investigative work into a clear and compelling case. For the victims, their families, and the investigators who had dedicated years of their lives to solving this mystery, justice was finally within reach. The world now waited to see what would happen next. The arrest made headlines around the world. After nearly 18 years of unanswered questions, investigators finally had a suspect in custody. But the legal process was only beginning. Federal prosecutors spent months reviewing thousands of pages of evidence collected throughout the investigation. Every document, every handwritten note, every forensic report, every piece had to be carefully examined before the case could move forward. The evidence gathered from the Montana cabin became a crucial part of the prosecution's case. Investigators also presented years of forensic findings, witness testimony, and detailed comparisons between the manifesto and the suspect's earlier writings. The defense raised several legal arguments throughout the proceedings. The case attracted enormous public attention, and the court carefully considered each issue before moving forward. As the trial approached, an unexpected development changed everything. Rather than continue through a lengthy public trial, the defendant agreed to plead guilty to multiple federal charges. The agreement brought one of the most expensive and complex investigations in FBI history to a close. The court sentenced him to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. For many victims and their families, the verdict marked the end of a chapter that had lasted nearly 2 decades. While nothing could erase the pain caused by the attacks, the conclusion of the case provided long-awaited answers. The Unabomber investigation also left a lasting impact on modern law enforcement. It demonstrated the importance of cooperation between local police departments, federal agencies, forensic scientists, behavioral analysts, and language experts. Perhaps the most remarkable lesson came from an unexpected source. Not a fingerprint, not a DNA sample, not surveillance footage, but language. Investigators showed that a person's unique writing style could become valuable evidence when combined with careful forensic analysis and other supporting facts. Today, the case is studied in criminal justice programs, law enforcement academies, and investigative training courses around the world. It serves as an example of patience, persistence, and the value of following evidence wherever it leads. For nearly 18 years, one individual managed to avoid capture despite one of the largest investigations in FBI history. In the end, it was not luck that solved the case. It was years of meticulous investigative work, public cooperation, scientific analysis, and the determination of countless investigators who refused to give up. The Unabomber case remains one of the most significant investigations in FBI history, not because of the crimes themselves, but because it demonstrated that even the most complex mysteries can eventually be solved through evidence, persistence, and the rule of law. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary and would like to see more well-researched stories about historic FBI investigations, famous criminal cases, and remarkable law enforcement operations, consider subscribing. Until next time, stay curious, question the evidence, and remember, every case leaves behind a story.